They thought he was just a poor old man and mocked him, but when he opened his gift, everyone in the room froze. What did he show that made the aristocrats forget their superiority? Watch to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Write in the comments what you think about it. The Harringtons prided themselves on their lineage, their wealth, and the unshakable status they had cultivated over generations. Their estate, a grand mansion built in the early 19th century, stood as a testament to their enduring legacy. Towering marble columns adorned the entrance, leading to an opulent hall where oil paintings of ancestors lined the walls. Their stern faces observed every visitor with a sense of judgment. The family had always valued tradition above all else, social standing, refinement, and an unbreakable adherence to aristocratic etiquette. The patriarch of the family, Edward Harrington, carried himself with an air of authority. His every movement was precise, his words deliberate. He had built upon the wealth of his predecessors, expanding their influence in finance and real estate. Though well into his 60s, he remained impeccably dressed, his suits tailored to perfection, his salt and pepper hair always neatly combed. His wife, Margaret Harrington, embodied the grace of old money, moving through society with a quiet but unyielding presence. She knew the importance of reputation and was deeply invested in ensuring their family's continued prominence. For years, they had groomed their only son, James, to follow in their footsteps. James had attended the finest schools, dined at the most exclusive clubs, and been introduced to the most eligible women from families of equal stature. It was understood that one day he would marry a woman who would uphold the Harrington name with dignity, a woman of refinement, poise, and most importantly, the right lineage. Thus, when James invited his parents to dinner one evening, hinting that he had significant news to share, Edward and Margaret naturally assumed it would be about his engagement. They had speculated among themselves about which eligible young lady he might have chosen. Perhaps Emily Sinclair, the daughter of a banking magnate, or Sophia Bennet, whose family had ties to European aristocracy? The evening was set with an air of expectation. The dining room was lavishly prepared, the table adorned with fine china and crystal glasses that sparkled under the glow of a grand chandelier. A team of servers moved seamlessly around the room, ensuring that every dish was presented to perfection. Margaret had taken special care in selecting the evening's wine, convinced that this would be a moment to celebrate. James arrived, looking as composed as ever, though there was an unfamiliar edge to his demeanor. He greeted his parents, exchanged the usual pleasantries, and took his seat at the long mahogany dining table. Edward, ever direct, wasted no time. "So, son," he said as he took a sip of his wine, "you've called us here for a reason. Shall we hear it?" James hesitated briefly, glancing at his mother before returning his gaze to his father. "I wanted to tell you both personally," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm on." Margaret exhaled a quiet breath of satisfaction, exchanging a knowing look with her husband. "Wonderful news," she said, her smile poised. "And who is the lucky young lady?" James set down his glass carefully before answering. "Her name is Sarah." The name did not carry the familiarity they had expected. No Sinclair, no Bennett, no recognizable ties to their social circles. Margaret's smile barely faltered, but Edward leaned slightly forward, his interest piqued in a way that hinted at scrutiny rather than enthusiasm. "And her family?" Edward asked. "Which of our acquaintances might we know them from?" James had anticipated this moment. He knew his parents well enough to predict their reaction, but he remained firm. "Sarah comes from a different background," he admitted. "She wasn't raised in our social circles." There was a pause. Margaret, always the one to uphold decorum, was the first to respond. "That's not necessarily a concern," she said with measured grace, "as long as she understands the responsibilities that come with being a part of this family." Edward, however, was more pragmatic. "What exactly do you mean by different background?" he pressed. James met his father's gaze directly. "She's the daughter of a craftsman. Her father, Thomas, is a woodcarver." Silence fell over the table, the air suddenly heavy. Margaret's fingers rested lightly on the stem of her glass, though she made no move to take a sip. Edward studied his son as though deciphering a foreign language, his expression unreadable. "A woodcarver," he repeated. The word held a weight of implication, though his tone remained neutral. "Yes," James confirmed, "he's been a craftsman his entire life." Edward leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "And where does he live?" In a small town outside the city, James said. A quiet place. Nothing extravagant. Margaret finally spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. James, you must understand our concern. Marriage is not just about love. It's about compatibility, about shared values and expectations. The woman you marry will represent this family. James's jaw tightened. Sarah is intelligent, kind, and deeply principled. She shares our values in the ways that matter. Edward's expression remained impassive, though his fingers tapped lightly against the table. She may share certain values, but her upbringing is vastly different. Her father, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. He would be your children's grandfather. What do you know about him? James's response came without hesitation. He's a good man, hardworking. He raised Sarah with love and integrity. The room remained silent for a long moment before Edward spoke again. I see, he said at last, his voice even. Well, we will, of course, have to meet them. It was not an invitation, it was an obligation, a necessary assessment. Margaret nodded in agreement, her smile practiced, but not entirely genuine. Yes, she agreed, we should meet them. After all, family is the most important thing. But beneath those words lay an unspoken understanding. The Harringtons would decide for themselves whether Sarah, and by extension her father, were truly fit to join their ranks. The house where Sarah had grown up was nothing like the Harrington estate. It was small, modest, and full of warmth, a home that felt lived in, where every object held a story. Unlike the grand marble halls of James's childhood, this house had wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot, walls decorated with handmade carvings rather than expensive paintings, and a kitchen where the scent of spices and fresh bread lingered long after a meal had been prepared. Thomas, Sarah's father, had lived in this house for over 40 years. He had built much of it with his own hands, just as his father had before him. The furniture bore his craftsmanship, chairs with elegant carvings on their backs, a dining table smoothed by years of careful hands, and shelves filled with figurines of animals, faces, and abstract designs, all sculpted from wood. Thomas himself was an old man now. His skin, deep and rich in tone, was marked by time, his face lined with the wisdom of years. His hands, rough and calloused, told the story of a life spent working, shaping, creating. His hair, once thick and dark, had turned mostly gray, but his eyes remained sharp, warm, thoughtful, and full of a quiet intelligence. He was a man who had seen much in his lifetime, had endured hardship and loss, but had never lost his dignity. Sarah had always adored her father. As a child, she would sit beside him in his workshop, watching as he carved intricate designs into blocks of wood, transforming them into something beautiful. He had taught her patience, had shown her the value of careful hands and steady work. More importantly, he had taught her to respect people, not for their wealth, but for their character. Now, as she sat with him at the worn wooden table in their small kitchen, she watched his face carefully, gauging his reaction to the news she had brought. A dinner with James's parents, Thomas repeated, his voice calm but thoughtful. Sarah nodded. They want to meet you before the wedding. Thomas took a slow sip of his tea, his gaze distant. I see. Sarah hesitated. She had not wanted to tell him about the Harringtons' reputation, not because she thought he wouldn't understand, but because she knew how they would see him. A simple man, a craftsman, a man who had not built wealth but had built a life. They come from a different world, she admitted. They have a certain way of seeing things. Thomas chuckled softly, setting his cup down. A certain way of seeing things, he repeated. You mean they think I'm beneath them? Sarah exhaled, feeling a pang of guilt. I don't know that for sure, she said, but I do know they place a lot of value on status. Thomas nodded slowly. I've met people like that before, he said. They see money as a measure of worth. It's not new to me. He looked at his daughter with a quiet smile. But I am who I am. I won't pretend to be anything else. Sarah smiled back, relief washing over her. She had always known that her father would not be intimidated by people like the Harringtons. He had spent his life standing firm in who he was, and he would not change now. Later that evening, James arrived to formally extend the invitation. Thomas greeted him warmly, offering him a seat. You treat my daughter well, Thomas said, watching the young man closely. That's all that matters to me. James met his gaze and nodded. I love her, he said simply, and I respect you, sir. Thomas studied him for a moment, then smiled. Good, then we'll have no problems. The dinner with the Harringtons was set for the following week. Thomas, ever practical, did not concern himself with what they would think of him. He had nothing to prove. But Sarah worried. She knew the Harringtons were not coming to meet her father with open minds. They were coming to judge. The Harrington estate stood tall against the evening sky, its grand facade illuminated by the soft glow of chandeliers visible through its tall windows. The long driveway, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and marble statues, led to an entrance flanked by towering columns, each a testament to the family's wealth and social standing. Inside, the dining room was prepared with the same meticulous attention to grandeur that had defined the Harringtons for generations. A table of polished mahogany stretched across the room, its surface adorned with fine china, gleaming silverware, and a centerpiece of fresh orchids arranged in a crystal vase. The air smelled of expensive wine and delicately seasoned dishes, the scent blending seamlessly with the faint trace of aged wood and the ever-present aroma of wax polish. Margaret Harrington, draped in a deep emerald gown, made final adjustments to the seating arrangement. Her expression was composed, but beneath her practiced elegance, there was a trace of unease. This evening was not merely a dinner, it was an assessment. Edward Harrington, clad in a tailored suit, stood near the window, his gaze set firmly on the long driveway outside. "They're late," he murmured, though the clock showed they were precisely on time. James, standing near the fireplace, turned at his father's comment. "They'll be here soon," he said evenly, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Then a car pulled up outside. The butler opened the grand front doors, and Sarah stepped out first, dressed in an elegant but simple black dress, her hair neatly styled. Her posture was poised, but there was a tightness in her shoulders. Behind her, Thomas emerged from the car. He wore a well-pressed suit, old but well cared for, with a dark brown tie. His movements were slow and deliberate, the weight of his years evident in the way he carried himself. He leaned slightly on his cane, not out of weakness, but out of habit, a steady presence that had walked him through decades of labor and perseverance. As they entered, the stark contrast between the two worlds was impossible to ignore. Thomas, a man shaped by time and toil, stepped into a home where wealth had shielded its inhabitants from hardship. The marble floors gleamed beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, the walls lined with the artwork worth more than entire neighborhoods. The butler, though well-trained, hesitated a fraction of a second before offering to take Thomas's coat, as if uncertain how to address him. Sarah took her father's arm gently and guided him forward. "Mother, father," James said, stepping closer, his voice steady. "This is Thomas, Sarah's father." For the briefest of moments, silence settled in the room, heavy and telling. Edward and Margaret had spent decades mastering the art of refined social politeness, but even they could not entirely mask their reaction. Edward's lips pressed together slightly, and Margaret's perfectly sculpted smile froze just a fraction too long before she extended her hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thomas," she said, her tone smooth but cool. "Thomas is fine," he responded, shaking her hand firmly but without the deference she was accustomed to. Edward extended his hand next, gripping Thomas's just a bit too firmly, as if testing something unspoken. Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "Shall we move to the dining room?" Margaret suggested quickly, regaining her composure. The transition to the dining room was seamless, but the unspoken divide remained. Thomas walked with quiet dignity, his gaze absorbing the extravagance around him without awe or intimidation. He had seen wealth before, perhaps not this level of it, but he had never measured a man's worth by the weight of his possessions. Dinner began with carefully rehearsed pleasantries. Margaret led the conversation with the usual topics: the weather, travel, art. Sarah did her best to ease the tension, but James could see the subtle undertone in his parents' demeanor. Every word, every glance, every polite but distant smile was a measured evaluation. Then, as expected, the conversation took the turn everyone had been waiting for. "So, Thomas," Edward said, setting his glass down, his voice light but edged with something more pointed. "James tells us you're a craftsman." Thomas nodded, taking a sip of water before replying, "That's right. I've been carving wood for most of my life." Edward tilted his head slightly. "Fascinating. And you make furniture, among other things?" "I specialize in intricate carvings," Thomas answered, "masks and sculptures. Some of my work is used in cultural exhibitions." Margaret raised a delicate brow, her interest only surface deep. "How interesting. Do you sell them at markets?" Thomas smiled faintly, recognizing the attempt to place him within a specific, familiar category, one that fit their narrative of a working-class artisan. Some, yes, others are commissioned privately. A few pieces have been passed down through my family for generations. Ah, Edward said, exchanging a brief glance with his wife. A family tradition, then. Something like that, Thomas replied. Sarah sensed where this was going, and her fingers tightened around her fork. Edward took another sip of wine before continuing. I suppose every family has their own way of preserving legacy. For us, it's been finance and governance. For others, craftsmanship. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment, a subtle yet unmistakable statement that there were levels to society, and Thomas occupied a different one. Thomas remained composed, his expression unchanged. True enough, he said, setting down his glass. Though legacy isn't just about wealth, it's about what we leave behind for the next generation, what they carry forward. There was a flicker of something unreadable in Edward's gaze, but he did not argue. As dinner continued, Margaret took the lead, steering the conversation toward the wedding. We've been making arrangements, she said, dabbing her lips with a napkin. Of course, we wanted to ensure that the ceremony reflects the dignity of both families. Sarah bristled. James and I were hoping for something more intimate. Margaret smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. Of course, dear, but a wedding is also a reflection of the families joining together. We have certain expectations. Thomas glanced at Sarah, then at James. His daughter's lips were pressed together, and James's jaw was tight. He had seen this before, parents shaping the future to fit their own vision, without considering the desires of those who would actually live it. As dinner drew to a close, Margaret and Edward turned to Thomas once more. You must be very proud of Sarah, Margaret said, her tone still carrying that thin layer of distance. Thomas met her gaze steadily. I am, he said, more than I can say. Edward leaned back, observing him. And what will you be gifting them for the wedding? He asked casually, as if it were an innocent question. If you don't mind me asking. It was not an innocent question. It was a challenge, a subtle way of reinforcing the unspoken difference between them. The Harringtons would provide a grand wedding, an inheritance, a future shaped by wealth. What could Thomas possibly offer that would compare? Thomas took his time before responding. Something meaningful, he said simply. Edward smiled faintly. I see. But he didn't, not yet. The weeks following the dinner at the Harrington estate were filled with a whirlwind of activity. The Harringtons had taken complete control of the wedding planning, transforming what was meant to be an intimate ceremony into a grand spectacle befitting their status. Sarah had initially resisted, insisting that she and James had envisioned something small, personal, a ceremony surrounded by close family and friends, not an extravagant display of wealth. But her voice had been drowned out in the flood of plans, preparations, and pronouncements from Margaret and Edward Harrington. The venue had been changed from the quiet garden Sarah had dreamed of to a lavish ballroom in a prestigious hotel. The guest list had expanded from a handful of close friends to over 200 influential figures from high society. Every detail, from the floral arrangements to the music selection, had been carefully curated to reflect the Harrington name. Sarah was exhausted. She had spent countless hours sitting through meetings with wedding planners who treated her as a mere accessory to the event rather than the bride. Decisions were made without her input, dresses were chosen based on elegance rather than comfort, and speeches were crafted to emphasize the importance of family legacy rather than love. James, though supportive, found himself caught between his loyalty to Sarah and his parents' unwavering expectations. He reassured her time and again that the wedding was just one day, that their life together mattered more. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one day. It was about control, about dominance, about reminding her and her father where they stood in the grand hierarchy the Harringtons upheld. And Thomas saw it all. He had watched quietly as his daughter grew weary, as her once bright excitement dimmed beneath the weight of expectations. He had listened as she vented her frustration, her disappointment in how her wishes had been sidelined. And through it all, he had remained silent, knowing that there were battles a father could not fight for his daughter. But he could still do something. One evening, long after Sarah had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in his workshop. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls, flickering over the wooden carvings that surrounded him. His fingers traced the surface of a small wooden mask, one of many he had crafted over the years. But tonight his mind was elsewhere. The Harringtons had made it clear that they measured worth in wealth, in possessions, in displays of grandeur. To them, legacy was defined by money and power. But Thomas knew better. Legacy was not something that could be measured in gold or marble halls. It was carried in the lessons passed from parent to child, in the traditions preserved through generations, in the quiet strength of those who refused to be broken by the arrogance of others. And so he made a decision. He would give Sarah and James a gift unlike any other, something that could not be bought, could not be replicated, could not be dismissed as insignificant. He reached into the depths of a wooden chest, pulling out an object wrapped in cloth. Slowly, he unfolded the fabric, revealing an old, beautifully carved wooden mask. The details were intricate, the craftsmanship impeccable. It was not just a carving, it was a piece of history passed down through his family for generations. Thomas ran his fingers over the polished surface, his thoughts drifting back to his own father, who had given it to him when he was a young man. He remembered the words spoken to him that day, the same words he would pass on to Sarah and James. This is more than wood. This is the hands of those who came before us. This is the wisdom of our ancestors. This is a reminder that we do not need gold to be rich, nor power to be strong. Thomas exhaled slowly. The Harringtons would never understand, but Sarah would, and that was all that mattered. The day of the wedding arrived, and with it came an air of extravagance that seemed to consume everything in its path. The grand ballroom of the prestigious hotel chosen by the Harringtons gleamed under the light of countless chandeliers, their crystal prisms casting a soft golden glow over the polished marble floors. Every detail had been curated to perfection, towering floral arrangements imported from abroad, a live orchestra playing a carefully selected repertoire of classical pieces, tables adorned with the finest china and silverware. For the guests, it was an event of the season, an opportunity to witness the union of one of the most distinguished families in high society. The air was thick with murmurs of admiration, subtle competition, and carefully measured pleasantries exchanged between those whose lives revolved around wealth and status. Sarah, dressed in an exquisite ivory gown chosen not by her, but by Margaret Harrington, felt like a performer in someone else's play. The dress was stunning, layers of delicate lace, intricate beading, a long flowing train, but it did not feel like hers. As she stood before the mirror in the lavish bridal suite, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. This was not the intimate wedding she had dreamed of. This was a spectacle. And yet, she reminded herself, the most important thing remained unchanged. At the end of the day, she would be married to James. That was what mattered. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the fabric of the dress, and turned toward her father. Thomas sat in the corner of the room dressed in his best suit, a modest but dignified choice. His presence, so starkly different from the grandeur surrounding them, was a quiet anchor in the chaos of the day. He had watched the transformation of the wedding with patient eyes, never voicing his thoughts on the excess and vanity displayed around him. But Sarah knew what he must have felt. She stepped toward him, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "You're the one getting married today, and you're asking me if I'm all right?" Sarah smiled, but there was an unspoken weight in her eyes. "I just want to make sure you don't feel out of place." Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his weathered fingers. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. "Don't let them make you forget why you're here." Sarah squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the steadiness of his presence. Then, with a final deep breath, she rose to her feet. It was time. The ballroom hushed as Sarah made her entrance. Heads turned, whispers passed between lips, but she barely registered them. Her gaze was fixed on one thing: James standing at the far end of the aisle, waiting for her. He looked handsome, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but it wasn't his appearance that made her heart steady itself. It was the warmth in his eyes, the silent promise that, despite everything, this moment was theirs. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause filled the room, blending with the swelling music of the orchestra. But as the evening continued, Sarah noticed something, a quiet tension that had begun to surface beneath the polished veneer of the event. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance from a guest, a hushed whisper exchanged between two well-dressed figures, a quick look of curiosity or disbelief directed toward Thomas, who sat among the crowd with his quiet dignity, unaffected by the scrutiny. Then, as dinner was served and the wine flowed, the tension became more pronounced. The Harringtons, particularly Edward and Margaret, had been carefully avoiding drawing attention to Thomas. They had introduced him politely, made the necessary formalities, but beyond that, they had subtly ensured that he remained an afterthought in the grand scheme of the evening. Until now. It began with an offhand comment from one of the wealthier guests, a man whose family had been longtime acquaintances of the Harringtons. "So, Mr. Thomas," he said, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, his voice carrying the same smooth arrogance that was so common in these circles, "I hear you're a craftsman." Thomas nodded, unfazed by the implied condescension. "That's right." The guest's lips curled into a smile that was just a shade too amused. "Fascinating. I imagine that must be fulfilling work." "It is," Thomas replied simply. "Creating something with your own hands gives a different kind of satisfaction." The other guest, another guest, a woman with an expression of polite disdain, chimed in. "And what sort of work do you do exactly? Furniture, I assume?" "Among other things," Thomas said. "Sculptures, masks, carvings with historical significance." Edward Harrington, who had been listening silently, took this as his cue to intervene before the conversation went any further. "Thomas is quite proud of his craft," he said smoothly. "It's a family tradition, I believe." Thomas turned his gaze towards him, recognizing the subtle attempt to place him within the confines of their understanding. "That's correct," he said. "Something passed down through generations." The guests exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued but still tinged with thinly veiled superiority. "Ah, tradition," one of them mused. "That's what really matters in the end, isn't it?" There was a chuckle from another side of the table. "Speaking of which," the first guest added, his voice light but edged with something pointed, "what sort of gift does a craftsman bring to a wedding like this?" The question hung in the air. Sarah tensed. James frowned. It was not an innocent inquiry. It was a challenge, a test, a means of reinforcing the unspoken divide between their world and Thomas's. Thomas, however, remained as composed as ever. He took a sip of water before answering. "Something meaningful," he said. The guest laughed lightly, not quite expecting the simplicity of the response. "Well," he said, gesturing around the lavishly decorated room, "I suppose we could all use a reminder that meaning matters more than price." Edward Harrington gave a small, forced smile, eager to redirect the conversation before it continued down this path. "I'm sure Thomas has something very special planned," he said smoothly. "Perhaps a handcrafted piece, something simple yet sentimental." Thomas met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Perhaps," he said. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered. The Harringtons did not know it yet, but before the night was over, they would come to understand that Thomas's gift was far more than they had imagined. As the evening progressed, the grand wedding reception unfolded with the same orchestrated perfection that the Harringtons had so meticulously designed. Waiters moved in synchronized motions, refilling glasses with vintage wines, serving delicately plated courses, and ensuring that no guest ever had an empty plate or an unattended need. The orchestra played soft, elegant melodies, providing a backdrop of refined luxury to the sea of impeccably dressed guests. The air was thick with conversation, laughter, in the subtle competition of social standing. Who was wearing what? Who had been invited? Who had secured the most lucrative business deals in recent months? Sarah sat beside James, her hand resting lightly in his as they smiled through yet another round of well-wishes and pleasantries. Though she had tried to enjoy the evening, there was an unease in her chest that refused to fade. She could still feel the glances, the hushed comments about her father, the careful maneuvering of the Harringtons to ensure he remained a background figure rather than a celebrated part of the event. She knew it had been deliberate, the polite but firm distance placed between him and the other high-status guests, the careful sidestepping whenever his presence was acknowledged. It infuriated her, but she had held her tongue, unwilling to let it taint what was meant to be the happiest day of her life. Thomas, however, remained unbothered. He had not come here to impress anyone, nor had he expected anything different. He had seen enough of the world to recognize the quiet, refined cruelty of people like the Harringtons and their friends. He had spent a lifetime around men who thought money was the only measure of a person's worth. Their whispers did not affect him. Their laughter did not shake him. He sat quietly, watching the evening unfold, waiting for the moment when his gift would be revealed. The time finally arrived when Margaret Harrington gracefully stood from her seat and clinked her glass with a silver spoon. The conversations around the room fell into a hushed anticipation as all eyes turned to her. She smiled, the perfect hostess, radiating a poised elegance as she addressed the room. "My dear friends, family, and esteemed guests," she began, her voice carrying with practiced ease. "It is truly a joyous occasion to celebrate the union of our beloved son, James, and his beautiful wife, Sarah. Tonight, we honor not only their love, but also the coming together of two families, two histories, and the bright future that lies ahead." A round of polite applause followed. Sarah resisted the urge to roll her eyes at the carefully curated words, knowing full well that the Harringtons saw only one history as truly worth celebrating. Margaret continued, "As is tradition, we would like to take a moment to recognize the gifts given to the newlyweds, symbols of love, commitment, and the well wishes of those closest to them." Servants began to bring forward beautifully wrapped boxes, each bearing the insignia of the luxury brands they hailed from. There were extravagant pieces of jewelry, rare art pieces, a set of handcrafted Italian crystal glasses, even a deed to a vacation property. Gifts fit for the standards of the Harringtons' elite circle. Then, almost as if it had been forgotten, one of the servants hesitated before bringing forward a different package. It was not wrapped in gleaming paper nor adorned with ribbons. It was a simple, unassuming bundle, carefully wrapped in dark cloth. There were no visible signs of wealth, no indications of grandeur. Margaret's smile remained intact, though a barely perceptible flicker of hesitation crossed her eyes as she gestured toward it. "And of course," she said, her voice carrying a careful neutrality, "we have a special gift from the father of the bride." The servant placed the package before Sarah and James. A ripple of intrigue passed through the crowd. A few murmurs exchanged in hushed voices. Some guests glanced at each other, barely containing their curiosity. Sarah reached forward, her fingers gently undoing the cloth wrapping. As the fabric unfolded, the object within was revealed, a beautifully carved wooden mask, rich in detail, polished to a flawless sheen. The deep brown wood held intricate patterns, swirls and ridges that seemed almost alive in their craftsmanship. The eyes of the maid, hollow but expressive, gave it an almost otherworldly presence, as if it held centuries of wisdom within its carved features. A breath of silence passed through the room, then a quiet chuckle. It came from one of the wealthier guests, a man seated near Edward Harrington. He leaned slightly toward his companion, whispering something with an amused smirk. Another guest raised a perfectly arched brow, hiding a laugh behind a delicate sip of champagne. A mask, a carved wooden mask, at a wedding of opulence and grandeur, among gifts of wealth and luxury. It was so absurdly out of place that some found it amusing, others pitiful. Margaret's smile remained fixed, though a shadow of polite discomfort flickered beneath it. Edward cleared his throat. "How unique," he said slowly, his tone carefully measured. "I assume this has some cultural significance?" Thomas, who had remained silent until now, nodded once. "It does." Another guest, emboldened by the hushed amusement in the room, tilted his head. "Would you care to share?" Thomas rose slowly from his seat, moving with the deliberate grace of a man who did not rush for anyone. The room quieted as he took his time walking towards Sarah and James, his gaze unwavering as he rested a hand on the mask. "This mask," he said, his voice even but powerful, "has been in my family for generations. It was carved by my great-great-grandfather, a master craftsman from a time when skill, patience, and meaning were the true measures of a man's worth." The air in the room shifted, the previous amusement faltering under the weight of his words. "This mask," he continued, tracing his fingers over the surface, "was given to my father on his wedding day, just as his father before him. It is a symbol of legacy, of history, of the wisdom passed down from parent to child. It is not gold, it is not encrusted with jewels, but it carries the hands of those who came before us." A hush settled over the guests. Some looked uncertain, others visibly uncomfortable. Margaret's smile had faded, replaced by a delicate unreadability. Edward said nothing, but his fingers twitched slightly against his wineglass. Thomas turned towards Sarah and James, looking at them, not at the audience, not at the Harringtons, but at his daughter and the man she had chosen to spend her life with. "I give this to you," he said softly, "not because of its worth in money, but because of its worth in meaning. Because love, family, and legacy are not things that can be bought. They are things that must be honored." A beat of silence. Then James stood. He stepped forward, lifting the mask from the table with reverence. He turned it over in his hands, studying the intricate details, the masterful craftsmanship, the weight of history it carried. "This," he said, his voice firm and unwavering, "is the most valuable gift we've received tonight." The hush deepened. The quiet embarrassment on some guests' faces became shame. Sarah reached forward, taking her father's hand in hers, her eyes filled with emotion. And for the first time that evening, Thomas smiled. A ripple of silence washed over the grand ballroom as James held the wooden mask in his hands. The laughter that had flickered on the lips of some guests had vanished, replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps even unease. The extravagance of the evening, the wealth on display, all of it suddenly felt hollow in the presence of something so simple yet undeniably profound. Thomas stood calmly, his expression unreadable, though his dark eyes carried the weight of generations within them. He could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air, lingering on the edges of the stunned crowd silence. The Harringtons had not expected this. No one had. They had anticipated something small, something sentimental but insignificant, something they could politely acknowledge before returning to the real celebration. Instead, they had been confronted with something far greater, something they could not measure in money or status. Margaret Harrington, ever the poised hostess, found her voice first. "That is a remarkable piece," she said smoothly, though her careful smile betrayed the tension in her throat. "It seems to have quite a history." Thomas gave a slow nod. "It does," he said, his voice carrying across the room, deep and steady. "More history than most things here tonight." Edward Harrington shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against the tablecloth. "Would you care to share that history?" he asked, his tone polite, though laced with a subtle challenge. Thomas studied him for a moment, as if measuring whether it was worth his time to explain. Then he turned his gaze toward the mask, his fingers running lightly over the carved surface, tracing the lines and patterns that had been etched with skill and patience long before he had been born. "This mask was carved by my great-great-grandfather," he began, his voice carrying through the stillness of the ballroom. "A man named Ezekiel. He was a master carver, known for his skill in creating pieces that told stories. Stories of our people, of our land, of the wisdom passed down through generations. But this mask, this one, was unlike any other he had ever made." The guests remained silent, their previous conversations forgotten as they listened. Even those who had dismissed Thomas earlier now found themselves unable to look away. "This mask was created as a gift," Thomas continued. "Not just any gift, but a wedding gift. Ezekiel carved it for his own son on the day of his marriage, just as his father had done before him, and just as it was done for every generation that followed. It was meant to be a symbol of strength, of unity, of the responsibility that comes with building a family. It was a reminder that marriage is not just about love, but about carrying forward the lessons of those who came before us." His gaze flickered toward James and Sarah, his expression softening just slightly. "It is given only to those who understand that legacy is not written in wealth, but in the choices we make, in the love we give, in the lives we build." A heavy silence followed his words. Sarah's fingers tightened around James's, and he returned the gesture, his grip firm. He understood now, more than ever, what this gift meant. It was not simply an artifact from Thomas's past. It was a piece of something far greater, something that could not be bought or sold. It was a testament to resilience, to love, to history itself. Edward cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "And this mask has been passed down in your family ever since?" Thomas turned his sharp gaze toward them. "For over 150 years. Margaret's fingers twitched slightly against her wineglass. "That's quite a long time." Thomas gave a slow nod. "Longer than many fortunes last." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some of the guests, particularly those who prided themselves on their own family histories, exchanged glances. They had spent their lives collecting rare art, investing in relics of the past, paying fortunes for paintings and sculptures whose stories they would never fully understand. Yet here stood a man who had inherited something beyond price, something not for sale, something more valuable than anything in their possession. The realization made some of them shift in their seats, made them feel, perhaps for the first time in years, as though they were the ones who had nothing to offer in return. Sarah took a step closer to her father, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "Thank you," she said, "for giving us something that truly matters." Thomas met her gaze, his weathered features softening. "It was never a question," he said simply. James, still holding the mask, turned to face his own parents. His voice was quiet but firm. "This is the most meaningful gift we've received tonight." Edward and Margaret said nothing, but their silence spoke louder than words. Thomas let the moment settle before speaking again. "A legacy is only as strong as those who choose to carry it forward," he said, addressing the room as much as his daughter and her husband. "What you inherit in life is not what makes you rich. It is what you pass on that defines you." No one spoke. No one laughed. For the first time that night, the Harringtons' grand ballroom, filled with wealth beyond measure, felt utterly small in comparison to the weight of Thomas's words. The air in the grand ballroom had changed. The atmosphere, once filled with quiet arrogance and unshakable confidence in wealth, now felt heavy with something else, an unspoken awareness that no one had expected. The lavish decor, the shimmering chandeliers, the crystal glasses and golden plates that had once seemed like the centerpiece of the evening now faded into the background. All that remained in sharp relief was the image of Thomas standing calmly, his hands resting at his sides, the weight of his history and legacy filling the space more completely than all the riches in the room combined. For the first time in their lives, Edward and Margaret Harrington were at a loss for words. Their carefully curated celebration, designed to showcase their status and superiority, had been overshadowed by something they had never anticipated: a simple, irreplaceable gift that could not be measured in monetary value. Their guests, some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in their circles, had fallen silent. It was clear that they too had felt the shift, though few would ever admit it aloud. Edward clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the stem of his wineglass. He had always believed in power, power that came from wealth, from lineage, from influence. And yet he had just witnessed something he could not control, could not belittle, could not buy. His world, built on exclusivity and privilege, had just been quietly undermined by a man he had dismissed before the evening had even begun. Margaret, ever the master of composure, took a slow sip of her wine, schooling her expression into one of polite neutrality. She had spent decades ensuring that the Harrington name carried weight, that their family remained untouchable in its prestige. And yet, here stood a man with calloused hands in a simple suit, a man they had subtly scorned, who had just commanded the attention of a room filled with aristocrats without raising his voice or flashing a single piece of gold. Sarah stood beside her father, her head held high, the warmth of quiet pride radiating from her. James was next to her, still holding the mask in his hands, as though it were the most delicate and precious thing he had ever touched. The silence stretched until, at last, Edward cleared his throat. "A remarkable history," he said finally, his voice measured, though not quite as steady as before. "Truly your family has carried this tradition for generations. That is commendable." There was no conviction behind his words, no arrogance, but no sincerity either. It was the response of a man who had spent his life in control, now grasping for something solid to hold on to. Thomas met his gaze evenly. "It is more than commendable," he said. "It is unbreakable." Margaret let out a quiet breath, setting her wineglass down. "Sarah," she said smoothly, turning to her daughter-in-law, "we appreciate the significance of such a gift. And of course, it is clear that your father values tradition deeply." Sarah saw the attempt at regaining control for what it was. "Yes," she said, "he does, because some traditions hold more value than wealth ever could." There was a shift among the guests. A few nodded slightly, others looked away, their discomfort evident. Some, those who understood the weight of legacy beyond material possessions, looked at Thomas with newfound respect. Others, like the Harringtons, struggled to reconcile their worldview with the reality they had just witnessed. James took a step forward, placing the mask carefully on the table in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was clear. "I've spent my life surrounded by things that are supposed to represent power, status, wealth, Everything I was taught to strive for was about making sure our family name remained untouchable. He turned his gaze to his parents. But I've realized something tonight. Margaret tensed. Edward's jaw twitched. The guests leaned in slightly. James looked at Sarah, then at Thomas. Wealth fades. Status is temporary. Power is an illusion. He rested a hand on the mask. But this means something real. Edward exhaled sharply through his nose, his pride clearly bristling at the turn the evening had taken. James, he said, you speak as though legacy is not built on stability, on ensuring a future for the generations to come. Thomas's gaze remained steady. And yet, the wealthiest empires fall. The strongest legacies are the ones carried in the hearts of people, not in the numbers on a bank ledger. Edward stiffened. Margaret's lips pressed together in a thin line. The room remained tense, the weight of Thomas's words pressing down like an undeniable truth. One of the guests, an older man with sharp eyes and a thoughtful expression, suddenly let out a quiet chuckle. You know, he said, tapping a finger against the rim of his wineglass, I've spent a lifetime buying things I thought would make me feel important. And yet, I don't own a single thing with the kind of history that mask carries. Another guest nodded. True wealth indeed. Edward and Margaret remained silent, their carefully constructed world fracturing in the face of something they could not refute. Thomas simply inclined his head. We all choose what we leave behind, he said. The question is whether it will be remembered. The evening carried on, but the mood had shifted irreversibly. The conversations that followed lacked the usual shallow bravado of high society. Some guests approached Thomas, asking about the craftsmanship of the mask, the stories of his ancestors, listening in a way they had not before. Others, including Edward and Margaret, remained withdrawn, processing what had unfolded. Sarah and James stood side by side, watching as the world they had once known struggled to accommodate something greater than itself. As the night came to an end, Thomas prepared to leave. Sarah embraced him tightly. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. He smiled, resting a weathered hand against her cheek. This is your journey now, he said. Make it one worth remembering. James extended his hand, and for the first time, Thomas clasped it, not just as his daughter's husband, but as a man who had finally seen the truth beyond the surface. As he walked away, his figure retreating into the quiet of the evening, there was no doubt left in the minds of anyone who had witnessed the night's events. The richest man in the room had never been Edward Harrington. It had been Thomas all along. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more great content. Share this video with others who might find it interesting, and check out our other videos for more compelling stories. Thanks for watching.